Life is simpler now. Time and tide have set the boundaries of choice. Is it to stop and wait the gathering storm hand in hand? Or should we merely slow the pace and press ahead, your painful sacrifice enabling me to strike a few more blows? Life is simpler now, defined no longer by what we do, so much as who we are. I am your security, my companionship, your only haven from the buffeting of strange winds, deeply felt and little understood. Life is simpler now, no longer knitting these two lives with threads of conversation, but with the wordless assurances of love, the motions of my soul, more deeply tender, hammered by the blows of adverse winds. Love more pure, intense, emerges from the fire. Life is simpler now, God's good gift for two busy people who celebrate the past and quietly wait with hope.
Well, love is never easy, is it? Some people like to leave out of their vows, for better or for worse, because they don't want to stick through thick and thin. But that's what true love is sticking through thick and thin.
He felt like he had already made a vow to her on the day he married her, and it was just simply that choice to live out that vow to her. I guess in some ways it echoes what I've seen in his walk with God. He doesn't get too concerned about, why is this happening? Did his wife has Alzheimer's? Or why did he have to step down from the presidency?
We decided this is it. And if the Lord wants to intervene and heal her as we ask, well and good. Work a miracle in her, or if he does not choose so to do, work a miracle in me.
Mom loved life. She was just a little bit crazy. You never knew what she was going to do or what she was going to say. And her laugh was her hallmark. So you could always hear it across campus. Oh, Mom's on campus, and I could hone in on that sound and find her. But it was an infectious laugh.
Muriel was a delightful person. A bit unconventional at times. She was a vivacious woman, very outgoing, very frank and outspoken, and she wasn't hiding anything. What you saw was what you got.
She went at life full speed ahead, with great love for everyone that she met.
She could never tell jokes, because she'd forget the punchline or tell it in the wrong order. But she just saw life in such a fun way. Some people see a glass half full or half empty, and she saw it funny. And if it wasn't funny, she could make it funny.
Well, she was pretty. So that's what first caught my attention. But then I found she had a personality to go with it. She was vivacious and fun-loving. She was very smart and talented, a great artist and musician. I just loved her.
Muriel was so different than Robertson. He was rather formal and quiet, and she was artistic and playful and fun, and she was a remarkable lady.
Muriel was a year ahead of me at CBC. And we had assigned chapel seating, and she was assigned to sit in front of me. And I was captivated by her wavy hair and her lovely fingers I just liked to sit where I was sitting.
They were different in many respects, but they really enjoyed each other. And she would tell funny stories on Robertson, and he would laugh tremendously, and then he felt free to tell some on her.
Well, From Mother, I learned never to take life seriously. That anything that's worth doing is worth making into a game and making fun.
Muriel was a free spirit. She was a happy person. She was a supportive person. She was the kind of person that you wanted to be around, enjoyed being around. She loved her family. She loved her husband.
I was young. I was younger than her. And I graduated from college when I was 20, I guess. And we decided that we were too young to go ahead with this without testing it, because we had heard that distance extinguishes a little flame and inflames a large flame. And we were going to be distant. She was going to teach in Bluefield, and I was going to school in Chicago. And we asked the Lord if we'd had no contact for 6 months, was it a little flame or the real thing? So sure enough, at the end of 6 months, I visited Bluefield, and it was Valentine's Eve. And that's where I proposed to her. And she said, well, I've got to pray about it. I said to myself, pray about it? You've been chasing me for 3 years. Why do you have to pray about it? But at any rate, she had to pray about it. And I always accused her of putting it off on Valentine's Eve so we could become engaged on Valentine's Day.
People mattered to her immensely. Anyone she met, it was like they were family. She would just adopt them into her life, and their problems were her problems, and their joys were her joys. She loved babies, she loved children. Anybody's babies, anybody's children.
She loved people. Best of all, she had a passion for God. And I just wanted that treasure to be mine.
She would engage in the water fights in the kitchen with us. She would, chase us around and play. I remember when I was little, she would read to us, but she told us later that her friends would, complain about the fact that she wasn't cleaning house well enough. And she said, well, it's much more important to read to my children.
Our first daughter, Marty, was born in California, where I was in seminary. Then in Columbia, our son Bob was born. We moved to Van Lippen and Asheville, North Carolina, where the next two, David and Jan, was just a baby when we went to Japan.
And I can remember the trip to Japan. We went on a freighter. So here's this ship with no railings. It's just got posts with chains. And my mother had a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 5-year-old. So she had us on leashes. And she would, keep a hold of us that way. We would it was a freighter, so it was filthy. I mean, the coal smoke coming down all over everything, including us. And we have a photograph of my sister Jan, who's 1-year-old, and Mother has her in this little tiny ceramic sink in the cabin, and her face was literally black. I mean, coal black. I mean, not just her face, her whole little body. She just covered it. She's just grinning happily, and Mother's washing her up.
Then, when we went to Japan, where probably the average family size was 1.5 kids, and we already had 4, but we were foreigners anyway. So Amy was born on New Year's Day, and a couple of years later, Kent was born, and Muriel always said she wanted to have 12 children. But when Kent was born, she said, let's call him Noah Moses. And I said, well, honey, that's neither in Japanese or English, a name that people use these days. And she said, yeah, we ought to call him Noah Moses. Then we could shorten it to No Mo.
So there was always lots of kids, always lots of activity, always lots of noise. You know, Mom right there in the middle of it, you know, contributing to everything. We always had pets, and that Mother didn't like pets, but she loved her children. And so our house was always filled with all these things that we would bring home. So we would bring home baby cats and baby dogs, and I remember we had rabbits at one point, we had birds. Oh, and then my brother Bob started bringing home snakes. That was cool.
She really partnered with me in Japan. She was raising 6 children, and you'd think that'd be enough, but no, not enough for her. When we came back to Columbia, she asked some of the faculty wives and executive wives, what in the world could she do? And they said, why, honey, you don't have to do anything. Well, nothing could have dampened her spirits more than that.
It's from '68 on, when they were living here on campus, she would begin to meet with the young people and find out their problems and begin to try to find solutions for their problems. So the married students, she found out that they were really having trouble making ends meet, and so she started a clothes closet for them where people could donate clothes. She started a furniture barn where, while they were living here in school, they could take furniture out, borrow it, use it, and then bring it back for the next, you know, families that were here. She started a food co-op, you know, where they could get food. She would teach courses on and do speaking engagements on women in missions and the unique challenges that, you know, wives and mothers have to deal with in foreign countries.
She's this flurry of energy and creativity and activity. I remember that it seemed like she always had something aimed towards people going on. She was like caring for the international students, caring for student wives.
I don't know how many couples she helped bring together or broken hearts that she helped to mend. One time there was this man who came up to the president's house to visit what he thought was, you know, the president's wife was going to be full of pomp and ceremony. And here was this laughing, backslapping, warm person, and I don't know what he said, but he said something, and she threw a pillow at him, and he just couldn't imagine a president's wife doing something like that. Mom and Dad would always tease each other and hug each other freely in front of us, and sometimes when they were kissing, Mom would blow up Dad's nose. And, you know, you would think that someone who's always proper would be aghast at such antics, and yet he, you know, embraced her and loved her, and I think that was part of what made him fall in love with her, maybe.
She was an artist, and she decided to make puffets, she called them. They were puppets, but you cut them out of foam, and she created a TV segment for a very popular children's TV program, and it was about obedience and various things for raising children properly.
My friend is always with me, just as close to me as prayer. With my eyes I cannot see him, but my heart knows he's there.
She started a radio program, which would be morning talk time, and she was so intriguing that many businessmen would tell me they pulled over to the side of the road just to catch her little talk show. In fact, the station was talking about syndicating it. We were on a vacation and business trip to Florida, Muriel and I. She loved to tell stories, and we were friends, a couple, and she had this pretty long story, about a 5-minute story, and then she'd laugh, and then 5 minutes later she started on the same story. And I said, honey, you just told us that. She laughed and went ahead and told it. And I said to myself, you know, that's never happened. What's going on? Muriel was an artist, and she had done a portrait of my predecessor as president of Columbia, and it was really a wonderful portrait and hung in the boardroom. So the board asked her to do one of me, and she just couldn't get it right. It was a cartoon, but they hung it anyway, and then she sneaked down at night and took it out of there, tried to work on it.
My wife and Muriel went shopping, and Muriel, it was one of these sort of discount places where you could find a bargain on shoes, and she filled up a grocery store cart full of shoes. Full. And my wife said, Muriel, we can't afford all these shoes. You're going to have to pick a couple of pairs. And she wanted them, and there was a little bit of a personality tug there. And finally, my wife got her to pick a few pairs, and my wife paid for them. We got back to the hotel, or they got back about the time we were out of meetings, and Robertson's first question was, how much do I owe you? What happened? And before my wife could tell me this story, she caught on, something's the matter. Then Robertson whispered to me that there were signs that were disturbing.
Okay? They're doing great too.
Alzheimer's is a gradual thing. You don't just all of a sudden say, oh, well, you're acting funny. It's, very, very subtle things start to crop up. She retells the same story. She asks the same question. She has difficulty making meals. It's a very gradual, subtle thing.
When we began to notice that there was a problem, some of us, we were living in different places. And I was living in Myrtle Beach, and I had a sister living in Columbia, one living in Charlotte, brothers living in, one in California and one in Chicago. And then Dad, who was living with her. And we all were coming, depending on how much interaction we had with Mother, at different stages, there was family discussions about, is there a problem? No, there isn't a problem. I don't see any problem with her. You guys are, crazy. And then others saying, no, there's a problem. And then the arguments about what the problem was. So it was over a period of years that we had these conversations. And my sister Jan began reading up on Alzheimer's-related disabilities.
We worried about her heart one time and took her to the hospital, and there's a young doctor there who called me out in the hall, and he said, you better think about Alzheimer's. And I was unhappy with that. These young upstarts, what do they mean? I'd hardly even heard the term. But we decided to go to a neurologist, friends of ours, to have him checked out, and that was about 5 years after the first incident. And I don't remember much of the interview, but it was rather brief. And he was testing her. He asked her who the president was and what day it was, and she didn't know, of course. But then he thought he'd got an easy one for her and said, name the Gospels. And she was sitting up on the table, and I was sitting down there. She looked at me pleadingly to help her. She couldn't get it. So that's kind of sad.
She was such a bubbly person, and she was, well, I used the word crazy in the sense that she was unpredictable and lighthearted and would say things, and then we would solve the pattern.
She lost her ability to be a hostess. Now, for the first lady on campus not to be able to entertain guests, important guests, that was pretty much of a loss. But I remember we had important guests, and her meal was 5 salads. That was it. So we began to cater.
Transcribing her tapes, and sometimes she'd be writing people, and sometimes she'd be doing it for the radio program. And she would put a cassette recorder in the windowsill in the kitchen in here and talk to it. And she'd be walking around the kitchen, and she'd walk out here, and she's still talking. And my secretary's trying to figure out, what did she say? Because you can't hear her now. She's going down the hall. And then she'd come back, and I remember one day, the recorder fell into the dishwater in the sink. And she's still talking. She's shaking it out and putting it back up on the window ledge. And my poor assistant trying to figure out, what is she saying? There were these gaps like the Nixon tapes with what did she say? But it didn't bother her, and that's just sort of who she was. But it got worse, and that's when the radio folks really had to pull.
She wouldn't give up. She gave up the radio program, but she kept speaking engagements, but she'd always come home crushed because she'd lost her train of thought and it was a bust. Finally, a missionary on furlough who attended one of these women's conferences came to me and said, "You really need to get her off the road. She's an embarrassment to herself."
And that was very difficult for her because she was still aware of being herself. She hadn't really deteriorated enough to where she was lost in her mind. She knew that this was what she was supposed to be doing, and it was being taken away from her, and she didn't know why, and she couldn't understand it. And so that was very, very painful for her.
But I do remember one very gracious lady who's in her 90s, and she used the word Alzheimer's with me. She said, "How's Dr. McQuilkin dealing with Muriel's Alzheimer's?" And I said, "Well, we're not using that word." And I explained it, and she listened very graciously, and she said, "You go back and tell him something for me." She said, "I don't know what a 90-year-old lady has to say to a world-renowned college president, but I know something about this." She said, "He needs to know what he's dealing with, and he needs to be willing to say the word, because he's the one that's going to have a bigger problem than she is. And she's going to be blissfully ignorant, and the family member, the one closest, is the one who's going to suffer the most with the disease. So you tell him that from this 90-year-old lady, that he better get ready for it."
I remember I used to like to take her shopping with me in the grocery store. But when she started going down another aisle and filling up somebody else's basket with stuff off the shelves, it wasn't all that much fun.
There was the stage where she would, the inexplicable things. She would begin taking the towels out of the closet, cutting them into little pieces, folding them up and stack them on the counter. Take a dress out of the closet, lay it on the bed, cut it up into little pieces, fold it up. I mean, you don't know where this is coming from, but it would really make very amusing family stories. You know, because once you've accepted the fact that it's the disease, it's not mom, then there's no being upset with her, you know? And because she had a quirky personality all her life, she was always one who was doing odd things anyway. This was the perfect way for her to get Alzheimer's. You know, just continue doing odd things that there's no explanation for.
She had to see Robertson. You could pacify Muriel if she could see Robertson. And whether Robertson was in a conference, had someone in his office, I don't remember that detail, but she wasn't getting to see Robertson, so she took off her shoe and hurled it at the secretary. And things became pretty public then.
Muriel became very agitated, and when I would leave her, she was almost incorrigible. She wanted to be with me.
And he was the president of the school. Very, very busy schedule. He was writing books, he was traveling, he was speaking in chapel, he was teaching classes, he was leading the faculty.
I was way back in the boonies in Tanganyika, Tanzania now. And the girl who stayed here and took care of her got through to me on a little telephone way out in the wilderness. I stood out there in the desert and there's a little box of a telephone, and she said I had to come home instantly. And she couldn't handle it. Well, wiser heads prevailed, and I finished out that conference, but I realized that I better take her with me. So one of the times I took her with me was to the Orient, and we went to several different countries and wound up in our own Tokyo. We were staying at the team center where they had a guest house. And I left the room for just a moment, as I recall. And when I came back, she was gone. I was petrified. This is Tokyo, largest city in the world. So I went out in the streets, and as I was walking down this street, I thought, well, she may be going further the other direction. So I go back and forth, and couldn't find her. So I went to the police box nearby, told them, and I came back to the center dejected, and the field council was meeting. So I told them to please pray for me, and just before we began to pray, we heard that laughter at the front gate. And she was delighted. She'd had an adventure. She had found a schoolyard with kids playing, and she stood there and watched them, and they were so fun until a real nice teacher came out and got a taxi cab for her. Put her in the cab, and then we learned the cab took her to the police box, and they knew exactly where we were. So the Lord rescued us on more than one occasion. She loved to pick flowers. When we were walking, I'd have to protect the neighbor's flowers from her, because she'd pick flowers and come back and put them in a vase. And one time somebody gave us a pot of lilies. I came in, and in the kitchen, she had broken one off and put it in a pot. And I said, honey, if you break those off, they're going to not live very long. So just let them be. Well, a day or two later, I was with my youngest Kent out on the side porch. And here she comes, smiling sweetly with one of the lilies, bringing me a love gift. And put it down in front of me on the table. And smiled and left. And I said, thank you, honey. Kent said, you're improving, Dad. The board provided a caregiver to live here in this home with her. She called him her jailer. Her job was to escape.
Well, it's her house, and here's this strange woman in here, in her kitchen, and she couldn't deal with it. She couldn't cope with that. So she began walking down to Dad's office to try to find him.
She'd escape from here and go zipping past my house because she wanted to be with him. And she'd go on up to the administration building to find him, and she was anxious until she did. She'd slip loose from whoever it was that was watching her here, and she was pretty cunning about it. And then she'd hightail it right up the street and end up finding him at the administration building. And because that she felt comfortable with him.
I would look out my window, and here would come this very sprightly, gray-haired lady just charging down the street outside my office window, walking very energetically. And then it wouldn't be too long, she'd come charging up the street. And then I'd look out a little bit later, and there she would be again, sometimes multiple times during the day. I was still new, so I didn't know everything that was going on, and I asked, what is this? Oh, I was told, that's President McQuilkin's wife. That's Muriel. And why is she walking back and forth? Because she loves him so much.
She had to be with me. She was discontented without me, so she would walk down to campus, which is about a half mile, and she was a speed walker. But when she would get to my office, the secretary would say, I'm sorry, somebody's in there with him. So she'd turn around and walk back. But a little while later, she'd come down again. So one day she made the round trip 10 times. And I was helping her undress at night. When I took off her shoes, her feet were bloody. And later I told our doctor. But when I told him this story, he choked up and said, what love?
He told the board that when Muriel needed him full-time, that he would be available for her, and the board needed to get ready for that.
In the middle of the night, I thought, she needs me full time. And this school needs a full-time president. And they can get another president, but she can't get another me.
But I think the first that I knew about it was when he called me in his office and he asked me to take over. He was going to talk to the board about this. Would I be willing to become acting president?
And I said, Robertson, you can't resign. My attitude was, this whole ministry here of then Columbia Bible College and Seminary was Robertson. His leadership, his insight, his integrity, his spiritual ministry, his thoughtfulness and vision, all of that. And it was just hard for me to comprehend, having served on the board a good while and been chairman a fair amount of that time, to think of CIU, as we call it now, without Robertson.
He was the life of the revitalization of the Bible College and the graduate program, and he'd brought in some really good people, and he designed these courses which are still foundational in the curriculum.
I said, whatever it is, we'll do that as a board and make sure she's wonderfully cared for, lovingly cared for. But you must continue as president, which he did for a full year. The chairman usually comes over early to meet with the president privately before board matters and so forth. And in that early meeting that next year, Robertson, almost in tears, said, now, John, you are my best friend. Whether he said best or not, I don't know, but in that situation, I knew what he meant. You must not argue with me this time. If you are my friend, you must understand I have to do this. And the conversation then got fairly emotional. And I knew I could not argue any longer. He was going to resign, and I was going to support his resignation after that conversation. For a man to take that position and to see her deterioration, how could I have argued?
I haven't in my life experienced easy decision-making on major decisions, but one of the simplest and clearest decisions I've had to make is this one, because circumstances dictated it. Muriel, now, in the last couple of months, seems to be almost happy when with me, and almost never happy when not with me. In fact, she seems to feel trapped, becomes very fearful, sometimes almost terror. And when she can't get to me, there can be anger. She's in distress. But when I'm with her, she's happy and contented. And so I must be with her at all times. And you see, it's not only that I promised in sickness and in health, till death do us part. And I'm a man of my word. But as I have said, I don't know with this group, but I have said publicly, it's the only fair thing. She sacrificed for me for 40 years to make my life possible. So, if I cared for her for 40 years, I'd still be in debt. However, there's much more. It's not that I have to, it's that I get to. I love her very dearly, and you can tell it's not easy to talk about. She's a delight. It's a great honor to care for such a wonderful person.
I was there in Shortest Chapel in 1990 when Mr. McQuilkin announced his resignation. I don't think anybody who was there could forget it. I think the comment that really struck me the most was when he was explaining that he was going to step down. He said this. He said, you know, I don't have to take care of her. I get to take care of her.
What does this mean to him? What does it mean to his family? What does it mean to CIU? What does it mean to the alumni? What does it mean to the faculty? And it was a time of real transition. But I think it's one of the most memorable events in the history of the school. It's when Robertson left the presidency. This was a historical marker.
I greatly admired his willingness to step back from what had been his life work and to spend that time taking care of her.
When he resigned, she was still walking around, dressing herself. You know, you just had to keep scissors out of her way. Feeding herself, you know, Dad had to make the meal.
He would do the cooking, but she would wander around and as he was cooking, take the ingredients to other parts of the house. So he'd have to go looking for the ingredients, and she dumped a jar of pennies into the toilet.
She was forever escaping. One day, a nice gentleman came up to the back door with her in the car, and she had been out in the middle of Main Street.
So he mama-proofed the house. He put not just deadbolts on all the doors, but key-operated deadbolts. So you pull the key out, there's no way to, because she would sit there, you put 4 deadbolts on that, she would sit there fiddling with things, and she'd be out. You just never could tell. And he fenced in the backyard, put a gate so that she could go in the backyard, she could go in the house.
I've been there when Muriel was still mobile, and she would come through the room walking. She did a lot of walking, and we'd be chatting, and he would speak kindly and lovingly to her. But, you know, he took it in such a natural fashion. It was just refreshing. There was no sense of, certainly no embarrassment or no need to apologize, and he didn't do that kind of thing.
I remember one time when, soon after we moved out from here, a new freshman and his wife came to visit us in our little Japanese garden. Muriel had always wanted a Japanese garden, but I wasn't into gardening then, but I created one a little late. So here we are sitting in the garden. He said, "Mr. McQuilkin, do you miss being president?" And I said, "You know, I never thought about it, but I don't. I like my job. I like to learn how to cook, garden, and I love my wife. No, I don't miss being president." So that night, as I was going to bed, after I tucked her in, I thought, you know, Lord, I never asked why. I asked, why not? So many people died in the night. Why not me? We're in a fallen world. So I'm not going to ask you about that. However, if the coach puts the player on the bench, he must not need him in the game. So sometime if you'd like to tell me why you put me on the bench, I'd be grateful. So the next day, we were at that time we could walk about 1 block. We walk around the block. I'd had to hold her hand. She was unsteady. And we came along the Monticello Road, which is very busy traffic, right to the curb. And this one stretch, there's an embankment on the other side. So if we met somebody, I thought we'd be in trouble, but we never did. But this day, I heard shuffling behind me, and I looked around, and here was a local derelict weaving his way down behind us. And I thought, well, he'll never make it. He'll never catch up. But he did, and he weaved right out into the traffic and around in front of us, and he turned around and looked at us, looked us up and down, and he said, "That's so good. I likes that. That's real good." And then he turned off and weaved off in front of us, mumbling to himself, "That's so good." And I laughed because you like affirmation from whatever source. So We got back and we're sitting there in the garden. And all of a sudden it hit me. I said, Lord, could you talk through the half-inebriated voice of a local drunk? You did. And if you say you like it, and you say that's good, that's all I need to know. Of course, through the years, people would say, she doesn't know you, and why don't you just put her away and get on with life?
What was difficult for me was losing her as a mother. She was such a wonderful person and so smart in being able to come up with solutions to problems. And all of a sudden, this person that I had relied on all my life and had given me all these great ideas and been my emotional support was no longer there for me.
To me, a mother was still herself. I still saw that same spirit. The spirit that I'd known since childhood was still there. The outer sort of packaging was changing, but the spirit was still there. And I was grateful that we still had her as much as we had. So for instance, even when she was, for years she hadn't been speaking, she couldn't walk very well, and she would see a child, she would just light up. She loved babies. When you would sit next to her, she'd pat you, and she'd, stroke your hand, hold your hand. That loving spirit persisted right up until the end. She wasn't focusing her eyes or her mind on anything. It was just kind of midair out there. And you would sit down next to her, and she would reach out with her hand, and she would take your hand, or she'd pat your hand. She'd reach up and stroke. She wasn't looking at you. She knew you were there, and she would just reach out in love.
Some people who get Alzheimer's get really impossible to live with. The personality changes. But she was only 3 months as sort of a rebel. And pretty soon she was more like a 5-year-old and then a 3-year-old and then an infant in my arms those last 20 years.
What impressed me was the deep, deep love between them. And it was agape love, but it was also romantic love. And the way he cherished her, the way he spoke of her, it was delightful. And of course, as we saw her go further down, she couldn't respond to him. But that did not, in what I've seen, change the way he responded to her. It was a beautiful thing.
Before I learned about diapers, I was cleaning her up in the bathroom, and she was objecting and didn't want me to take her soiled slip off over her head. And all of a sudden, the radio was on in the next room, and it was Chuck Swindoll preaching. And he booms out, "Men, are you at home? Really at home?" And I said, "Yeah, Chuck, I'm really at home."
He was a humble man through the whole process. Never thought of himself as doing anything outstanding, and I so appreciated that. He felt he should have no honor or glory for what he's doing. It was his duty, it was his right, it was his privilege. That's what he felt. She cared for him all his life. He wanted to care for her all of her life, and he certainly did. And the spirit of the man, which was a gift from God, that was the Holy Spirit working in him. And that's what stands out so much.
On pretty days like today, for instance, she would be out in the garden. He had a Japanese garden in his back. And she would be out there wrapped up, and he could see her through his window in the study. Robertson made a supreme effort to include Muriel as if they were a married couple keeping house. He worked with her. He bought a convertible just so he could put her in it easy and take her places with him.
He would report little things like he would put up a flag in front of the house in days when she smiled, and it was so nice to see the flag flying out in front of the house.
There were times, even when she was that she would look at you and smile. And the sense I got was that she didn't know who you were, but she knew she loved you. You're one of my family. You're one of the people I love. I don't know what your name is, but I love you. I've always loved you. So that she never lost that emotional understanding and recognition of you. I knew that she'd always loved singing, so I would just get out the hymn book at night, and she's lying in the bed, and I would just, sing hymns to her.
I had the privilege of helping Dr. McQuilkin with one of his writing projects, and that probably gave me the closest glimpse I had of those years when he was primarily at home. He did travel some, but his main priority was taking care of his wife. How attentive he was to her, and the evident love between the two of them. Anybody who had the opportunity to see that up close, and I'm talking now about some of the later years, but the sweetness of the relationship was something very, very special to see.
I loved her maybe more than ever before during those days, but she couldn't love me back, and that was lonely. I remember one time when she was in bed, she hadn't spoken for 2 years, a word. She still would smile sometimes when she woke in the morning, but no talk, one-way conversation. So this particular day was Valentine's Eve, and I was doing my exercise cycle at the foot of her bed. I had asked God to please let me outlive her. And so to help with that, I did this thing that I hated and got my exercise. But I talked to her all the time, And I said, honey, I read that both the caregiver and the care receiver are both victims. And I said, we're not victims, are we? We love one another. So I'm chattering away to her. And I said, we really do love one another, don't we? And she woke up from her sleep and looked at me and smiled. And just as clear as a bell, she said, love, love, love. And then went silent again. Probably her last words, love.
I remember that Dad had said that his research had showed that Alzheimer's patients generally lived 7 to 10 years after diagnosis. She lived 25. Her mind was going, but her body wasn't. She was in perfect health.
Finally, it came to a place where Muriel could not swallow. We had agreed early in life that we would not take heroic measures when we came toward the end. But I figured out a way to feed her. I could fill a huge syringe and put it behind her tongue and put liquid food in there. Then the hospice nurse came and she says, we call that heroic measures. And I realized I should not continue that because our agreement. I asked the Lord, well, I didn't really pray it. I just thought, Lord, it'd be so nice if I could be with her when she dies. So one morning as I was shaving, heard these gurgling sounds in the next room, and I said, shall I finish? No, I better go. And I went, and she moved on in my arms. So my unspoken prayer request was answered, but I had these churnings inside. I didn't know how I felt, and that's what people said, how are you doing? They love you. They want to know, how are you coping, they probably said. So Finally, my daughter helped me figure it out, and I came up with the thought that I'm grieving, yes. But I'm grateful. I wouldn't want her back. She's free, dancing with her son who died in a terrible accident, and they were great playmates. So
my spiritual feeling when Mom died was one of that her spirit had been bound in this body that was deteriorating for years, and now it was free. That person that I knew, the one I remembered, that crazy wild woman that loved everybody and loved God and loved singing and loved art and loved babies, that was now unfettered and alive again.
Muriel taught me about love. It must be expressed. My parents didn't express affection. My mother would ridicule Muriel when she would come there because she was forever so mushy, always saying she loved me and hugging me and right out in public. But just to express it may not be genuine. It's got to be acted out. So the second thing she taught me about love is demonstrated. And really demonstrated in sacrifice. Greater love has no one than this, the one laid down his life for a friend. That's the way she lived, to me. She spent her whole lifetime trying to make my project go. And of course, that taught me to do the same for her, multiple projects. But then what happens when it breaks down? So the third thing she taught me is that love forgives. I remember one time after she died, and I was reading old love letters that I'd saved, and I found one that had been crumpled up and smoothed out. And it was a rude awakening at the time. I remember weeping because she was writing it to me, but it was never mailed to me. And saying all about my excellency, she always bragged about me. But she said, would it ever be possible for her to be right and me to be wrong? Wow. And then she concluded, well, this letter, like all the others, will no doubt end up in the trash. So I could tell. She decided that she and God would bear the burden and not me. She was forgiving, forgiving, forgiving. The fourth thing Muriel taught me about love is it partners. She really partnered with me in Japan. Anyway, she worked full time with me in the church planting. The thing she taught me about love was that it companions. What a companion. And then the sixth thing she taught me about love is it endures. It hangs tough. The seventh thing Muriel taught me about love was about how our relationship is a parable. It's a parable of how God wants to relate to his people. And I think it's a pretty good parable because the Old Testament uses it and the New Testament uses it as Israel is the wife of Jehovah and church is the bride of Christ. So it is with us that we are to mirror the relationship, that love relationship. That's what he's about. That's why he created us on his pattern. That's why he redeems us to restore the pattern from one degree of his glorious character to another by the Spirit of the Lord. Why does he do that? For that intimate love relationship. It's sundown, Lord. The shadows of my life stretch back into the dimness of the years long spent. I fear not death, for that grim foe betrays himself at last, thrusting me forever into life. Life with you, unsoiled and free, but I do fear. I fear the dark specter may come too soon. Or do I mean too late, that I should end before I finish, or finish, but not well, that I should stain your honor, shame your name, grieve your loving heart. Few, they tell me, finish well. Lord, let me get home before dark.